Imagine walking into a courtroom expecting justice, but instead being met with prejudice. A judge thought he had all the power. He looked at the black man standing in front of him and decided to teach him a lesson. What he didn't know? That man wasn't just anyone, was a top federal prosecutor. What happens next will leave you speechless. Have you ever been falsely accused or felt like no one believed you? Share your story. In the comments below, we'd love to hear how you overcame it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories. It all began with something so small, it shouldn't have even mattered. A black man standing in court over a minor issue. Something that wouldn't normally raise an eyebrow. But the judge, sitting high in his chair, didn't see a person. He saw an opportunity to show his power, to belittle someone he thought couldn't fight back. With a cold, dismissive tone, the judge delivered his verdict. Instead of a reasonable outcome, he handed down a fine that was clearly meant to hurt, not help. It wasn't about the law. It was about making a statement. The man didn't argue. He stood there silently, his face calm, but his eyes told a different story. He listened as the judge used his words like weapons, cutting deep in ways that weren't just about money, but about pride and dignity. The courtroom felt heavy, like the air had been sucked out. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces showing a mix of unease and anger. Some looked at the floor, pretending they hadn't seen what just happened. Others stared at the man, silently willing him to fight back, but no one dared to speak. The man held his head high, though. His silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. A refusal to give the judge the reaction he wanted. He didn't need to say a word, because his presence alone was a quiet act of defiance. As the gavel came down, the sound echoed through the room, final and sharp. The judge didn't even glance at the man again, already moving on to the next case like nothing had happened. But for the man, and for the people who saw it all unfold, the moment lingered. It was more than just an unjust fine. It was a reminder of how deeply rooted the problem was, of how far things still needed to change. But this is where everything changed. The moment the fine was issued, the man didn't react the way the judge expected. Instead of anger or frustration, he stood up slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. All eyes in the courtroom were on him, waiting to see what he would do. He adjusted his tie, and then, with a steady voice that carried through the room, said something no one saw coming. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," he began, looking directly at the judge. "I am a federal prosecutor. I've spent years dealing with cases just like this, exposing abuses of power and ensuring justice is served." The room froze. It was like the air had shifted in an instant. The murmurs that had filled the space earlier disappeared, replaced by a heavy silence. The judge's face, which had been smug and full of confidence just moments ago, drained of color. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. He blinked a few times, clearly trying to process what he had just heard. The man didn't stop there. "And let me make one thing clear," he continued, his voice still steady but now carrying a sharper edge. "What you've done here today is not just wrong, it's a misuse of the power entrusted to you. And I assure you, there will be consequences." Every person in the courtroom was on edge now, their eyes darting between the man and the judge. The tension was thick, and even those who had been too afraid to speak earlier couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the edges of his bench. Whatever confidence he had when he handed down that fine was long gone, replaced by an unmistakable fear. The prosecutor wasn't the kind of man to let injustice slide, especially when it was as blatant as this. Once he left the courtroom, he immediately began drafting a detailed complaint. He described every moment in vivid detail, how the judge had spoken down to him, the unnecessary fine, and the clear prejudice that hung in the air like a storm cloud. It wasn't just about his experience. It was about making sure no one else had to endure the same treatment. The complaint was thorough and unflinching, leaving no room for doubt. It didn't just focus on the incident that had unfolded that day, it questioned the judge's overall integrity, raising concerns about whether this kind of behavior was part of a larger pattern. Once the document was filed, it landed on the desks of people who couldn't ignore it. Legal experts were assigned to review the case. These were people who had spent their lives studying the law and holding those in power accountable. They didn't just take the prosecutor's word for it. They pulled transcripts, interviewed witnesses, and even reviewed past cases the judge had presided over. The deeper they dug, the more cracks they found. As the investigation gained momentum, whispers started spreading in the legal community. The judge, once seen as untouchable, was now the subject of scrutiny. Lawyers and former defendants began coming forward, sharing their own experiences of unfair treatment and questionable rulings. It was like a floodgate had opened. The media caught wind of the story, and soon the judge's name was making headlines. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, asking questions he didn't want to answer. He tried to spin the narrative, claiming he was being unfairly targeted. But the evidence against him was undeniable. Colleagues who had once praised him began to distance themselves, unwilling to risk their own reputations by defending his actions. His once impressive career started to crumble under the weight of public and professional scrutiny. The judge, who had always held power in his courtroom, now found himself powerless. The same system he had manipulated was turning against him, and for the first time, he was on the receiving end of justice. The judge was swiftly suspended from his duties as the investigation unfolded. The evidence against him was overwhelming testimonies from witnesses, courtroom transcripts, and even his own past rulings painted a clear picture of a man who had let his biases cloud his judgment for far too long. The suspension wasn't just a formality. It was the first step in a process that would hold him accountable. He was summoned before a disciplinary panel, a group of seasoned legal professionals who didn't tolerate excuses or half-truths. Sitting in the same type of chair he had once seen countless defendants occupy, the judge now had to answer for his actions. Each biased remark he'd made, every questionable decision he'd handed down, was brought to light and scrutinized. For a man used to commanding authority, it was a humbling and humiliating experience. Meanwhile, the prosecutor's story spread beyond the courthouse. It resonated with people from all walks of life, sparking conversations about fairness and accountability. News outlets covered the story extensively, emphasizing not just the judge's downfall but also the prosecutor's quiet determination. He hadn't shouted or demanded attention. He'd simply stood his ground and used the system to bring about justice. In communities where people often felt powerless against authority, the prosecutor became a symbol of hope. He showed that even in spaces that seem impenetrable, like a courtroom ruled by a biased judge, courage and persistence could make a difference. Schools invited him to speak to students, community leaders asked him to attend events, and social media buzzed with discussions about the importance of speaking up against injustice. The prosecutor wasn't looking for fame, but he understood the weight of what his actions represented. By standing up for himself, he had reminded the world of a fundamental truth. No matter how high someone's position may be, no one is above the law, and no matter how small or quiet someone's voice might seem, it has the power to create change when it's used to speak the truth. This incident wasn't just about one man standing up to a racist judge. It was a wake-up call for the justice system. It highlighted the urgent need for accountability and exposed how bias can infect even the highest levels of authority. It's a reminder that when people speak up and fight back, they can create ripples of change that go far beyond one courtroom. If you believe in fighting injustice and standing up for what's right, don't stay silent. Share this story. Start conversations, and let's hold those in power accountable. Together, we can make a difference.